undisputed king of stuff.
Happy to welcome to the Almighty King of Stuff podcast, Alexandra Hudson. She is hosting a brand new series on Wondrium. You might know them as the Great Courses. I know I have imbibed many of them in the past. And her series is called Storytelling and the Human Condition. She also has a book coming out in about 6 weeks, I think. And it's called The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. She's also an adjunct faculty member at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. She is the founder of Civic Renaissance. She does way too much for me to catalog here, but thanks so much for being on.
Thank you for having me, John. And publication date is October 10th for the book.
Oh, okay.
This year, but please pre-order now.
Yes, you can get it now. Head to Amazon. I will include a link in the show notes. So why don't you tell us about the idea behind this Wondrium series?
Thank you so much for having me and for that question. So the origin story of this series goes back to kind of my childhood, where I was raised on Wondrium, formerly Great Courses content. Mm-hmm. Every birthday, every Christmas, sometimes just for no reason at all, my father would go to his closet of mystery and come out with a new DVD or sometimes a VHS series of
an 8-track audio. Yeah,
exactly 8-track, exactly. And he would give me a new series. So American history, Greek mythology, astrophysics, like the basics of calculus, whatever it is. Like the teaching company Great Courses kind of was like the backbone of my education, really growing up. And more broadly, I was just raised in a very intellectually omnivorous home. My parents both modeled for us and consciously trained us to realize that education was not just something that happened in the classroom. It was a way of viewing the world and others as just with wonderment, with openness, with curiosity, and with the disposition that realizes that every experience and every person has something to teach us. And so this notion of education not just being something that happened in the classroom has always been really important to me. And the Great Courses, the teaching company Wondrium, was part of that. And so fast forward, several decades, and when they reached out to me about creating a series for them, it just felt like a beautiful life symmetry and like a life achievement unlocked that it had never been a life goal of mine, but it's like I added it to my life goal list just to be able to check it off. It's like, that was incredible. Like, how could that, is this really happening? And so we began the process of brainstorming several different ideas for different series. And like one of them that I'd still love to create one day is like how to unleash your creative potential, like how every single human being has creative potential, and like what does it look like to nurture that and nurture a creative passion to help us be our fully creative and the best version of our human selves, because I think everyone has a creative output to contribute to the world. And anyway, but we settled on this course, Storytelling and the Human Condition, and it was like great conversation and self-help angles, like great books, great storytelling from media, from culture, from across history, but showing explicitly what those stories reveal about what it means to be human and what it means to lead a meaningful life. And my hope is that anyone who enjoys the series kind of takes away that there are stories all around us all the time, whether they're active stories or they're stories about who we are as human beings in the world that we live in. And the more that we're aware of that, the more power we have to tell and retell both our own narratives and our narratives about the world around us that bring us more joy and that are more empowering. And we all have that power. There's a reason that the final episode is on freedom, storytelling and freedom, sharing stories of incredible people from Hannah Arendt to Phyllis Wheatley to Viktor Frankl, who endured enormous tragedy, but who harnessed the power of storytelling to help them reclaim their agency and lead rich lives. So thank you for inviting me to share a little bit about the series with you.
Oh, that's great. And one thing that I appreciated too, before we started recording, I mentioned I watched several of the episodes. And one thing that I liked is we've talked a lot about great books on this podcast, and I just got obsessed with them maybe 5 years ago. I did not grow up with them. I grew up with reading magazine articles and how I could get the most information with the absolute least effort. And about 5 years ago, I'm like, well, I hear everybody referring to these smart people. Maybe instead of reading about them, I should actually read them.
Amazing. Yeah.
But one thing that I love too in your piece is it's not just, oh, okay, let's talk Plato and Dostoevsky. It's Billie Holiday, Hannah Arendt, like you mentioned, and just bringing this all to what you call in the series, the Great Conversation. Now, why don't you tell us what that is? Because I think it's a concept. We talk a lot about great books in our culture, or at least starting to, but we don't talk a lot about the Great Conversation, which is kind of the point of reading all these old books.
Exactly. I prefer to use the language of the Great Conversation because over great books, because to me, the Great Conversation is not a defined canon of old male white thinkers. And it's not, so here are the three distinctions between the great books and the Great Conversation. One, it's not the Great Conversation, first of all, I'll define it, it's the iterative dialogue on big foundational questions of the human experience that people have been reflecting on and often answering through story across history and across culture. So the first difference is that it's not just books, the Great Conversation. It's across media. It's theater, it's art, it's sculpture, it's sitcoms. There are several more contemporary dramas in my series. Like there's Michael Schur's The Good Place. He's the producer who brought us The Office, Parks and Rec.
We love that. The whole family watched that.
Yes, exactly. And there's also HBO Succession, and those are put in dialogue with, for example, Dante's Inferno and A Line in Winter and the life story of the Buddha. So I intentionally across genre and across culture to again illuminate this idea that the Great Conversation is not just books. Second, it's not just old white men. Mortimer Adler, who famously assembled the kind of canon, right? There are several attempts to put together like who are the authors everyone should read. And one of the famous attempts to do that was Mortimer Adler's at U Chicago in the 1950s. And it wasn't until, and there were no women and no people of color in that first rendition. In the 1990s, he went back and I think he added one woman. I think it was Virginia Woolf to the canon. They still were people of color. And so, but I mean, that's obviously not true that people of color and, non-white males and women, it's not true that they didn't have anything to contribute, right? At all. It's not the case. And so that's another distinction between Great Conversation, as I define it, and great books. And that is why I have many people of color and many women that I feature their stories and the stories that they tell in the series. And of course, the Great Conversation is not just the West. The great books were primarily Western authors of the Western tradition, which are incredible. Like I love Plato. Like Plato's my guy, Augustine's my guy, Pascal's my guy. Like, these are huge intellectually formative for me, but I love branching out. And that's what I loved about creating the series. I loved remedying knowledge gaps. We're all captive to the educations that we were given. That's not a fault of our own. And that's what's fun about when our educational journey can really begin is after school, where we can start reading for fun. And so it was fun to, find echoes of Platonism in the Eastern tradition, right? And just like, so I'm a Christian, I have a faith background, and I believe all truth is God's truth. And I love finding truth, goodness, and beauty that has echoes in all different cultures and all different forms. It's not no one thinker or culture has a monopoly on these things.
Well, one thing that I really enjoyed too is when I started reading Plato and especially Greek philosophy, I would read one book of theirs and then read, I don't know, I'm trying to think, The Art of War or different kinds of Asian wisdom literature. And it was fascinating to see a lot of similarities, but also where they differed and just kind of their perspective on things. It was just kind of fun to compare, contrast how these two great civilizations kind of played off each other and each other's ideas. Another thing too, when you talk the Great Conversation, you need to read a lot of great books to appreciate someone awesome like my boy Frederick Douglass. Here's a guy with like zero formal education who is more brilliant than almost anyone alive today.
Yes.
And he was steeped in, he's talking about, gosh, I'm trying to think of all the authors. He would go through one paragraph and reference people from Renaissance France, ancient Greece, a modern thinker that's his contemporary. It was just amazing. Just weave these together in some of the best writing you've ever run across in your life. And that just kind of shows this great conversation. It's everybody's legacy that lives in the West, however loosely that's defined. And somebody in Singapore is kind of in the West. People working at one of these tech farms in India are kind of part of the West, and they can kind of jump into it, find out what they like, share their own perspective. And that's why these great books are great books. If a book, I don't know, Joe Blow the philosopher in ancient Rome just stumbled off a ship from Athens and tried to apply his wares, if he wrote a horrible book, we don't know about it because it stank.
Right.
The only books that survived were the great books that you had people copying and recopying, whether Muslim scholars, whether monks in Byzantium, all these people copied the best of the best. And that's why pretty much all these things, you're going to get something valuable out of it.
Absolutely. And it's incredible how there's literally a language barrier between us and the founding fathers and people who wrote in that era and even the decades and centuries after them, because they had this sort of cultural grid of which a central part were the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the classics, right? That's a huge part of the foundational aspect of education throughout Western history. And so they toss around these allusions, these references to Roman emperors and to Greek mythology that the people they're talking to in their day would get like that. Like we're talking about storytelling, right? Like allusions and metaphor, that's the language they used. And yet today, we do not have that cultural grid. And so it's like, we have no idea. Things could just go right over our head. We don't even get the superficial meaning because they're using names and referencing stories that we don't even know. So there's literally, it's really fascinating. I've noticed that in reading, the founding fathers or even Adam Smith, Alexis de Tocqueville, 100 years later, they just had an assumption about who they were talking to. And everyone could have had the same baseline of reading and knowledge base that we just can't assume anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that you brought up, which is very important, it's very important to me personally. I tend to be a walking spreadsheet. Here are the facts and figures. And so if I'm trying to convince someone of the brilliance of, I don't know, some dumb tax idea I had, I'll say, well, look at the charts. I made these, they're color coded. They're in Excel. Isn't that great? And people are looking at me like I'm utterly insane. It's like, no, this proves my policy is best. But no, I have to constantly remind myself, especially getting more and more into writing over the past decade at least, is just understanding the power of story and how stories are how we convince people. And even if we don't convince them, kind of share our perspective on it. I don't know, say 20 years ago, I could have this policy of here's how we fix poverty in the inner city. And it might have an insight or two, but hearing the story from someone who grew up in that environment, a dear friend of mine, I won't mention his name because I received permission, but he grew up in the south side of Chicago, in the shadow of Cabrini Green, one of the most notorious housing projects, lived in a car with his mom for several months. And hearing his story, I'm like, oh, okay, there's all sorts of things I haven't considered yet. And it's just great to focus on that need for story, whatever you're doing in life, whether you're in policy or politics, whether you're trying to convince a customer to buy your product, whether you're trying to convince your neighbor, yeah, this is why we have to organize and push this idea. So why is storytelling so much more powerful than just here's a bunch of bullet points listing the facts?
It's a great question. I don't think we actually know, but what we do know is that it is something deeply ingrained in our genetics and our DNA, is riveted by stories, and it always has been. Like, even in the pre-literate, not even oral tradition, like some of the oldest stories we have are paintings on caves from like 17,000 years old. And then, fast forward a little bit more, like we've been, the oral tradition, but in pre-literate societies, like we were just, it was how we passed the time. It was how we transmitted values. It was how we transmitted history. Who are we? And again, answer these foundational questions that the great conversation explores of who are we? Why are we here? And what is the best way to live? These are questions that we've reflected on and often answered through stories. I mean, so research out of Princeton University has found that the brainwaves of a storyteller and a story listener, they link up, and they are in sync when we are hearing and listening to the story. So again, that's not an explanation for why, but that's an explanation that storytelling is powerful. And we, again, it's not just a matter of sitting down and saying a story like once upon a time or a fairy tale, but it's recognizing, coming to appreciate that we live and breathe in stories. Like our inhabited lives are one long story. And again, one of my hopes with the series is that we can appreciate and just maybe come to recognize what are the stories that we are telling about ourselves, about the other, maybe, or who's the hero in our lives, in our framework, who is the villain in our lives, what is the story we're telling about the world around us, and how can maybe I tell a story that is a little closer to the truth and a little closer to cultivating my humanity and the humanity of others. So an underlying thesis of the course is that, I think I mentioned this already, but like all great works of art tell a story about the human condition. And that's why in the series I put all sorts of different works of art in dialogue and genres, so like opera and tragedy and song, and that all great art cultivates our humanity. It cultivates what's best in us. It makes us more humane, and it diminishes what is ignoble in us. And as our humanity is cultivated, we are better to appreciate the humanity in others. We're made a little more gentle and a little less savage, a little more kind. That is what the traditional education in the humanities did. It made us more human and more humane. And so that's very much the tradition I am building off of. That's what the liberal arts did. They were the liberating arts. They liberated us from our, they gave us true freedom, and that they liberated us from our ignoble passions, the passions that were cruel, the passions that made us monstrous and more like animals and more vicious. And so again, my hope is that those that enjoy the series are able to come away with an appreciation of the incredible power of stories to help us lead our lives better.
Yeah, and something that you bring up repeatedly too is just the power of stories to persuade. We in our society just like to slam people, troll people, bludgeon people with some bumper sticker slogan and shut them down on social media. How do we kind of reclaim this, I don't know, I guess a culture of persuasion? Because when I was growing up, the 1910s, I won't say my exact age, but that was kind of the purpose when you'd have discussion with people, is try to persuade them into, supporting your candidate, going to your church instead of the one down the street. That was kind of the goal of that. How do we kind of re-enable that kind of perspective where instead of just trying to mock and ridicule people who disagree with us, there are a lot of persuadable people out there, whether it's just someone in your neighborhood talking about a neighborhood issue, or someone in the more broader context?
It is such a great question. Like, we've lost patience. We've lost a tolerance for the work that comes with persuading people. And so I think a version of your question is like, what do we do when we encounter people that accept a story that is different from ours? And instead of trying to tell a better story, again, persuading them, we just immediately want to cut off and attack emotionally or physically sometimes, like people that accept different stories, different views of the world than us. And that is not a world that is conducive to human flourishing. That is not a world that respects the dignity and autonomy and diversity of the human experience. Like, diversity is the spice of life. Like, it's like of course, there are some stories that are bad, like stories that accept a worldview of racial hierarchy or child abuse. Certainly, this is not a total pluralistic world. There's a bad story, but when it comes to visions of the good and visions for how to pursue the good, what does it mean to accept a story that embraces human diversity, embraces that reasonable minds can disagree? And this is actually related to the question of my book, and the question of my book that's coming out in October is, how do we do this thing called life together, across difference. And this is the defining question of our species that we've been grappling with and succeeding to various extents since as long as we've been around. We've always wanted to be together. We know that we are more cooperative, we flourish, we're happier, we self-actualize, we fully become human in community, and yet it's hard. Doing life together is no walk in the park. It takes work, it takes effort, and everyone has a role to play in this effort
Yeah, and I think too, it's always important to remind people, I'm on Twitter far too much and other social media, and the culture there can be very toxic. Most of the people, well, a huge number of the people I follow are from the media centers. They're from DC, they're from New York City, tech people in the Bay Area, and you just see so much hostility in things. And then I walk outside my door and I go get gas and I see customers helping each other. And I see somebody spotting $10 to the homeless guy. I see people getting along great. Everyone holding the door open for each other, everybody joking with each other at the grocery store. And it's like, okay, this isn't as bad as it appears when you have this tiny sliver of people who are even on Twitter, and then you refine that even smaller to people who care passionately about politics and don't have a lot of patience for reading much more than a tweet. Yeah, you're going to have some weird dysfunctional attitudes, but there's a lot of people out there who just want community, and part of community is storytelling. Right. And it's going to involve religion and politics. It's going to involve, hey, can you help me out? My wife's on bed rest and we need someone to take our kids to school. That's how you build connections in the here and now. It's not like, let's install this policy in Washington, D.C. to fix this problem. No, a lot of it is just getting off my rear end and going out there and being a neighbor to someone.
That's exactly right. The final chapter in my book is on misplaced meaning and also forgiveness. But my theory there is that as these traditional touchstones of meaning, like church, like civil society, like community have been on the ascendant in recent decades, that we have misplaced our meaning from those things to politics. And we've made politics our be all end all, the core of our identity. It was where we drive our meaning. And that is why we aren't able to rationally and calmly disagree about matters of policy anymore. Matters of policy are personal. They're an extension of my identity, of who I am. And so if you're attacking my policy, you're attacking me, and I'm going to revert to fight or flight mode. I'm going to get defensive. And there's no having calm, agree to disagree, reasonable conversation with someone whose lizard brain is activated and in fight or flight mode.
Right.
Right. And so part of my argument is that we need to put politics in its place, make it matter less than it currently does. And part of doing that is not just saying politics matter less to me. It actively means creating space in our lives. It means actively creating space in our lives for better and more beautiful alternatives, like friendship, like intellectual curiosity and learning, and also encountering beauty, like having a nature walk, like taking up, just communing with nature. And those are just 3 examples of many that are possible mechanisms by which we can fill our lives with things that fill our souls. Because as it is now, we're all kind of running on empty emotionally and psychologically, and nothing's productive, nothing's helpful, and so nothing's
right.
So we need to fill the well first, and to be able to have the grace and equanimity that is necessary to have these conversations about important topics that need to be had.
Yeah, definitely. And just getting out of the cocooning that we do in the modern world, and we do more so every year. Something that made it worse was all the lockdowns. People, I'm constantly telling my male friends, you gotta spend some time with your buddies, with your friends. I'm very blessed to have a group of friends I meet with all the time. There's like 4 or 5 of us from college, and then there's 2 other guys who've known each other since junior high. And we get together every month and puncture each other's bubbles and support each other. And just having some kind of community in the real world will kind of get you out of the toxic internet only mindset a lot of us get. I wanted to get to one last thing since we're running out of time. You just wrote a piece, came out on Monday for Christianity Today, and this is actually a favorite subject of mine. You're comparing the Judeo-Christian story to the ancient Babylonian one. And I heard a guy say, kind of trying to compare ancient pagan religions to Christianity. No one sung a song saying what a friend I had in Zeus back in the day. It was a slightly different perspective. So why don't you tell us briefly about that article?
Yeah, so as I was creating this series, the vision for the series was to follow the human experience. So starting with origins. Who are we and how did the world come to be? What is the stuff of humanity? And then, of course, carrying through to suffering and pride and materialism, and then finally death in the afterlife and freedom, which is the final lecture. But for this episode on origin stories, it was absolutely fascinating to explore different stories from across history and culture about how the world came to be. One thing I learned is that there's a remarkable continuity of ex nihilo narratives, like for in a Chinese origin myth, there's something called the nebulous void, and that's just how the world came to be. There was a nebulous void that created the world, and of course, some people, and that's of course how God in the Hebrew Bible, the Judeo-Christian narrative, like he spoke the world into existence, right? One really interesting comparative that brought home to me and made me appreciate with fresh eyes the Judeo-Christian story that I hold to be true and that I have accepted my entire life was putting that story in dialogue with the Babylonian creation story. It's called the Enuma Elish. It's probably the oldest story in the world that we know of, probably dating back 15 to 70,000 years. And this story tells the story of generational warfare. So there are two primary gods, they have kids, and then this is also a common trend amongst origin stories across history and culture. The gods, there's parricide, there's infanticide, all the way through. Ultimately, a younger generation of God named Marduk, he's the order of the world is set. He speaks the world into being. And then the other gods, they complain, they say, we don't want to work anymore. I don't want to work. And
I hear you, ancient gods.
Yeah, exactly. Marduk's like, okay, I got you. And he decides he murders his mother's stepfather. And from his stepfather's blood, he creates man. And he says, I'm going to create a lowly and primitive creature to take our burden of work. And so man is created. Man has no special place in creation. Man is not man is created from a God's blood, but there's no special duty or authority that comes with that. And of course, man is created to serve, to be a servant, and created of violence. Like there's just been all this generational warfare, and man is both an afterthought and created of great violence. Contrast that to the Judeo-Christian narrative, where God, it's a very peaceful creation narrative. God just says, let it be. And it is. And he says, and God delights in his creation. After everything that God creates, he says, it is good. It is good. It is good. And after he creates man, well, first of all, he creates man. Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Like that notion of the imago Dei is so important in the history of Western thought, and not just Western thought, but also and something we take for granted today, which is human rights and human dignity. We take for granted that all persons have inalienable rights by virtue of just having our shared moral status as members of the human community. That is not something that this ancient Babylonian creation myth took for granted, and most of human history did not assume that to be the case either. And of course, so after God created man in his own image, he says it is very good. He's pleased. He's delighted with his creation, and gives them stewardship, gives them a special place amongst creation. And we're not created just to work. We're created to cultivate the earth and nurture the earth that God created. But he created us to delight him and for us to delight in him. Like, we're non-utilitarian. I just think it's so beautiful. And it just helped me appreciate this narrative that I took for granted my whole life.
Yeah. And in the article too, you refer to Dominion, a great book by Tom Holland. Everybody read it. But it is kind of like he brings up even people who are in bad faith, angry against religion and trying to bash it all the time, you know, in a jerky way, not like some principled atheistic or perspective, but just kind of yelling at people they don't like. They're usually attacking Christianity by using Christian morality. You guys don't care enough about the victims. This isn't fair. And it's like, okay, you do realize all those kind of came to the fore of culture because of Christianity. And yeah, we are far from perfect, to say the least, but it's just interesting how the world shifted so much with the message of Christ and Christianity just spreading throughout.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, where can people find your work? Thank you very much for spending time with us. We'll include a bunch of links in the show notes, but where are all the places people can find you? And there are a lot of things you're doing. So
thank you. Yeah, just go to alexandrahudson.com, and there you can enjoy the course for free. I'm giving away a free month of Wondrium, and of course you can enjoy my series on Wondrium, and there you can also sign up for Civic Renaissance, my newsletter and intellectual community dedicated to beauty, goodness, and truth, and the wisdom of the past, and where we talk about things like origin stories and the power of myth in our world. And if you want a little bit more beauty, goodness, and truth in your life, then please join us over there. Thank you.
Yeah, we all need that. Thanks so much for being on. Really appreciate it.